Thank you, everyone, for being here today. A very special thank you to Sandhya, Vikram, and everybody else at the BIC who has worked to make this event possible today. And especially to Aditya for suggesting that we do this here and for offering to have this conversation with me. It is truly a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak about my book today, which is, of course, very special to me. And this event is also very special because since the book came out, I have had a chance to speak about it in a number of other cities. But this is my first talk in Bangalore, and I'm very pleased to be able to share it with all of you here. This book is about the life and legacy of my grandfather, Justice A.M. Ahmadi, who was the Chief Justice of India between the years of 1994 and 1997. To most people, Justice Ahmadi was a public figure. He was a jurist whose name is often associated with landmark judgments and legal opinions. But to me, he was also the person with whom I had fierce and passionate debates about law, politics, religion, culture, everything under the sun. And he was also the person with whom I watched cricket matches on television and played board games with on Sundays. So, writing about somebody who loomed so large in public life and yet was so familiar in private was, as you can imagine, at times very easy and at other times very hard. I must confess that before I started this project, I had not read his judgments. But once I eventually did, there was a distinct sense of familiarity. The very sharp, incisive way that he had of looking at the world, the practical, commonsensical approach that he applied to even the most complicated of problems, and the seriousness with which he took his role. And as I read through his judgments and also his private writings, the one word that kept coming back to my mind was integrity. And the most defining moments in my grandfather's life have demanded this of him. Whether it was his dissent in the Babri Masjid case, or his willingness to take on cases that other judges were reluctant to touch, he never shied away, but he also never played to the gallery. He took difficult decisions and he held his ground. I won't say a lot more about these cases right now because I'm sure we'll get into them in our conversation later. But it is through the life of my grandfather that I have come to understand that fearlessness does not mean that you're never afraid. It means that you will act with integrity even when you are. And that's what I wanted this book to capture. So when people ask me why I chose to call this book The Fearless Judge, the answer is simple. It's because that's what I've seen. And with this kind of fearlessness also comes a clarity of thought and the ability to stay steady even when the stakes are high and the world is watching. Some of you may remember the Hazratbal siege in Kashmir. Militants had taken refuge inside the shrine, which contains a relic of the Prophet Muhammad, which makes it also a very important religious site. The army had sealed off the area with 150 people inside. Whether they were hostages or sympathizers was not clear, but there was no food, no water, no sanitation. In the beginning, government appointed negotiators tried to send food supplies in, but the army blocked this, saying that the militants would also get access to the food, and also they were worried about the safety of the people who had to go in to deliver the food. Several days passed, the standoff became more and more tense, and eventually the case came to the Supreme Court. And this was not just a domestic crisis, it had international eyes on it because it was happening after Operation Blue Star and also very soon after the Babri Masjid demolition. Both events had already gained a lot of criticism in international media. And so it was a very delicate moment, and India could not afford another misstep. During the hearing, Justice Ahmadi asked for a scale map of the mosque. He took this map back into his chambers during the lunch break and studied the layout carefully, drawing lines on it with a ruler. When the hearing resumed, he had identified a spot outside the shrine which the militants did not have a direct line of sight to and therefore could not fire upon. The court ordered that food and water be placed at this spot with no restrictions on who can access it. Because the state cannot deny anybody their constitutional right to life. And therefore, meals must be provided to everybody inside, whether they were suspected militants or civilians. A few days after this, negotiations resumed. The militants were persuaded to surrender peacefully. No force was used. Not a single life was lost. The order was very well received within international human rights organizations, who said that it was one of the most humane and measured judicial interventions in such a tense moment. This is an example of the kind of deliberations, the kind of pressures that judges must sometimes work under, the weight of their decisions that they must carry. And yet, the very best of them will find a way to steady the course. This book is also about the human cost of this high office, the sacrifices that public life demands, not just from the individual, but also from their entire families. I have seen the way that my grandparents have worked through some of these very difficult moments together, and the professional sacrifices that my mother and my uncle had to make because of the family's public facing role. These are not stories that make it to newspapers, but these are the stories that sustain public trust. And that's why they're important. That's why they matter. My grandfather retired in 1997, but some of the questions that he cared about the most, secularism, the integrity of institutions, the sanctity of the Constitution, these remain with us until today. In fact, I would argue that they're even more important now than they have ever been before. This book doesn't claim to answer any of these questions, but I hope it offers a way to reflect through the life of somebody who truly believed that the Constitution was more than a legal document. It's something that we live by every day, and therefore we must protect. So once again, thank you all for being here today. I look forward to the conversation and hope that you will all find it meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you, Insia, for your opening remarks and more importantly for writing this important book. Thank you, BIC, for this event today. It clashes with a very interesting event on Naxalism in Karnataka. I had half a mind to be there, but then Vikram is giving me the stare. So here we are. I take a moment to acknowledge the presence of Huzaifa Ahmadi, my friend and colleague from the bar at the Supreme Court, and Justice Ahmadi's son, and also Ram Gua, who's going to be delivering the Justice Ahmadi lecture in the days to come. I did not have the privilege of appearing before Justice Ahmadi because he retired in 1997 and I only enrolled in 1998. But of course, one had heard of him and read his judgments. And more importantly, in the context of the book, I was fortunate to be able to review it for Frontline when the book was released. So I've therefore had a close look at it and already, in a sense, expressed my thoughts on the book per se. But before I go into the book itself, I have 2 or 3 prefatory comments to make. One is that this book fills an important gap when it comes to biographies of judges. Now, friends who've been reading around lives of judges will agree that there is a severe shortfall, I think, of good biographies. And the reason for that is that the very good judges seem to be self-effacing and don't write themselves and don't like others writing about them. And the ones who perhaps should not be writing are published. So you then drift into the hagiography sphere. So with the exception of, say, Justice Chagla's, Roses in December and a few others, there are very few good biographies. And I think Insia's book importantly fills that gap on anybody's shelf in their library. Boswell was regarded as having written the greatest biography ever of Samuel Johnson in 1791. And then Justice Hidayatullah later termed his autobiography as My Own Boswell. But I think sometimes it's important not to be your own Boswell and let somebody else be it. And that's exactly what Insia has been to her grandfather. And on that note, I must say that despite her being related so closely to the subject of her book, Insia has been able to maintain a certain objectivity, I think, which is very important. Maybe that comes from her training as a journalist and a scholar, and importantly as a reader, one can discount the fact that the book is written by somebody who's related. Principles of natural justice say you will not be a judge in your own cause. And I can say with certainty that Insia, despite her doting affection for her grandfather, while writing the book, maintains a tone of objectivity and straightforwardness, which I think is very important. It's probably a blessing in disguise that she's not a lawyer, otherwise, we would have been burdened with far too many footnotes and references to the legalese. And I think the book strikes an important balance between the law, the judgments, and importantly, the man that Justice Ahmadi was. Which is where I also want to make one other prefatory comment, which is that books on lives of judges is in itself an important genre. Because others in public life already have a public voice and a public image. Lawyers do, IAS officers do, politicians do, etc. But judges are in that very difficult space where really their judgments speak for themselves. And particularly in the modern age where judges are critiqued heavily online, trolled, and really do not have a counter voice to the narrative apart from their judgments, I think it's important that more and more books are written on good judges, because then you hear that version. You get to know the man, you get to know the challenges, the integrity issues, the issues that the family faces, for example, in difficult times, which we will cover in our conversation. And when that comes out, I think that importantly not just gives a voice to the judge, but it gives a voice to the system, which I think is of much importance. And that's where I think Justice Ahmadi as a subject becomes crucially more important to me and to many of us, which is because of his role as an independent judge and somebody who stood up for the independence of the judiciary. There is, I think it's a no-brainer for me to say that the judiciary is facing a certain crisis. The legal system is facing a certain unique crisis as we speak. And that is where the stories of these judges who were able to have a spine, hold their own, remain independent, I think is extremely important. It's important because it's contagious and it's there to be emulated by lawyers, budding judges, fellow judges on the bench, especially. And that independence does not just come on the bench all of a sudden in a flash. It comes from a certain instinct for independence. And which is where Justice Ahmadi's life again becomes important, because you have to understand the difficulties he perhaps faced in his younger days. He had a unique position because he was a district judge who went all the way to the Supreme Court and became Chief Justice. That's not very common at all. Most appointments to the higher judiciary, especially in the Supreme Court, come from those who have made it to the high courts from the bar, in a few cases, directly from the bar in the Supreme Court. And that unique experience, not only as a district judge, but I have to say, as a Muslim within the system, I think is an important conversation. There's a part in the book, and I will be talking to Insia about this, where at the time of Justice Ahmadi's elevation to the Supreme Court, an unnamed senior judge in the Supreme Court is supposed to have remarked, but he is a Muslim, can we trust him? And I'm speaking about the 1990s. So it's not that the rot is new. And it is those visceral challenges, I think, which an individual faces build into their independence. And that's where, again, I think the book is important. On the book itself, we will be in our conversation trying to cover many facets of Justice Ahmadi's life and his relevance today. But as a judge, his judgments, of course, speak for themselves. The judgment in S R Bommai for me is one red-lettered one, because he underlined two very important principles of the basic structure of our constitution, which we took for granted for a long time, but I'm afraid we can't. One was secularism, the other was federalism. And both those principles stood out in that judgment. And today, I don't know if the judges predicted it then or not, but 30 years later, both of these issues are central to our conversation around constitutionalism. But more important than his views as a majority judge, his minority dissents, I think, are very interesting study. He dissented in the Bhopal gas tragedy matter. That's a dissent which, in a funny way, has resurfaced now after all these years because a curative petition came to be filed in the Supreme Court. He felt that the burden should not be on the common man when it came to paying compensation for the breach of what was really a private party's negligence. He dissented, interestingly, even in the matter relating to appointment of judges and the collegium system, which again I think is a debate that is up for grabs. But perhaps the most interesting, which Insia alluded to, was his dissent when it came to the judgment relating to the Babri Masjid. And that was a challenge to the 1993 Act, which provided for acquisition of certain portion of land in Ayodhya and vesting it in the government. Now, this is, I think, a very, very interesting sub chapter or chapter, not only in the book, but I think in our Indian history. And if you look at the trajectory, you had a Places of Worship Act in 1991, which maintained status quo on all religious sites except Ayodhya. Then you had an application in the Supreme Court for permission to conduct car seva. And this is a part in the book where INSEA refers to the proceedings in the Supreme Court leading up to the permission that came to be granted for this car seva. This matter came up on November 28th, 1992, a little after the 1991 Act. The application for car seva, it came up before a bench of which Justice Ahmadi was not a part. There was opposition to this application. And the book quotes the submission of an advocate O.P. Sharma, who opposed this application, and I quote, Shri Sharma asserts, this is from the judgment, Shri Sharma asserts that the previous experience of what happened between 6th and 26th July 1992 should put the court on guard and examine whether the state government is adopting a stratagem to enable the collection of a large mass of people who ultimately will be allowed to and formally blamed for taking the law into their own hands and pleading its own helplessness. This was an almost prophetic submission that this gentleman made. The court didn't find favor. It permitted this symbolic car seva. We know that the rest is history, because then followed the disgraceful demolition a week later of the masjid on December 6, 1992. The 1993 Act then came into being, which tried to somehow legitimize this entire process by providing for this disputed portion to vest in the government on the pretext of public order. On that judgment, Justice Ahmadi dissented. He dissented along with Justice Barucha, another giant of our system. And when this demolition of 1992 in fact took place, Justice Ahmadi is quoted, and this is where I think the insight of an insider matters, because we would never know these things. Justice Ahmadi had told his family to quote, "Remember my words, India will never be the same again." And he is spot on. And this is somebody who lived and grew up in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, and therefore had a ringside view of the realpolitik of India that we're seeing today. So to finish this chain, the 1993 Act was upheld by the majority. It held that the performance of namaz is an essential religious practice in Islam, but the mosque itself is not. And in a funny way, that set the base for the ultimate Ayodhya judgment, which came to be passed, which acknowledges in black and white the villainy of demolition of the structure, but nonetheless holds and paves way for the temple to be constructed there. And of course, the last link in this chain is the actual construction of the temple and all the politics, etc., that goes with it. And this is the paradigm in which, friends, I would like you to recognize the book and its importance. An interesting part is that the book also brings out some of the political machinations that took place behind the scenes, which I think make for very interesting reading. Those of you who have read Jeffrey Toobin's book, The Nine, on the judges of the Supreme Court, it's gossip. It's interesting, right? It's spicy. And here you find some interesting and some bizarre scenes taking place behind the scenes. I won't give you spoilers. Please read them. But this brought into the fold the relationship and the friction even between three giants of that time: Justice M.N. Venkatchalaya, Justice J.S. Verma, and Justice Ahmadi, all three Chief Justices, three tall individuals, but obviously with serious differences in opinion and in ideology when it came to delicate matters such as these. And there's a part in the book where Justice Ahmadi says that when he was invited to look at the draft judgment relating to this 1993 act, the Ismail Faruqi's judgment, Justice Bharucha was not even in the room. And remember, Justice Bharucha was a Parsi. And at that point, when Justice Ahmadi expressed his discomfort, saying, "Why is the fifth judge not part of this conversation? We're a constitution bench." The majority is supposed to have said to him, "Once we agree, we're sure he'll come around." Well, certainly not. Those of you who knew Justice Bharucha was hardly going to come around. And ultimately, Justice Ahmadi and Justice Bharucha dissented on this matter. And that dissent, I think, in some ways, is an important moral reflection on where we have gone as a country. But for me, it's important that this book traces the role that judges can play within the system and the role that courts play within the larger sort of politics, the cultural politics of our nation. So with those comments, friends, I thank you again for being here, and we'll now move to the conversation. Thank you. Insia, let me begin by asking you, it's in a way an obvious question about the writing process, but I'm asking it not just in the context of you being a writer, but in the context of you being the granddaughter of the subject. What research methodology did you deploy? And importantly, how did you maintain that arm's length while writing the book?
Well, it was a very intense process. And in the beginning, I had somewhat underestimated it. Because, you see, to me, Justice Ahmadi was simply my grandfather. I had been raised in his home. I had watched him at every step of the way, had long conversations, arguments, shared jokes, all of that. So I thought that all I would need to add to my personal narrative would be his judgments. But of course, this is a very naive way of thinking, which I realized quite early on when I started writing. Because he was such a multifaceted personality, and there were so many different aspects to him, which I discovered when I started reading the hundreds of pages of judgments, speeches, reports, all of that, which I had to do as a part of my research, and also through the conversations that I had with people. And I began to realize that although I knew my grandfather very well, I did not know Justice Ahmadi, the legal statesman. And so writing this book became a sort of a journey of discovery for me as well. One of the most significant aspects of my research was about talking to people and collecting as many stories and perspectives as I could. So I've spoken to family members, friends, members of the bar, members of the bench, old secretaries, peons, all of this with the intention of making the story richer and adding depth to it, of course, but also to maintain that distance, to make sure that I remained objective through the process. And I also traveled to a number of different cities to meet people who had known my grandfather at different phases of his life, so that I could get a fuller picture of his journey. Because, you see, a large part of doing something like this in an honest way is to acknowledge that if a life has shaped history, then it cannot be without complexity, it cannot be without nuance. And that means exploring not just the victories and the moments of triumph, but also the difficulties, the challenges that the person may have faced along the way. Not to say the process was free of challenges for me either. The most significant challenge, I'd say, was not having my grandfather with me to ask questions, to ask for clarifications when I was writing. followed closely by the lack of first person accounts, because most of my grandfather's contemporaries are either no longer alive or their memories are not intact. And archival research also has its limits, because the further back in time you go, the less documented things are. And in my case, I was going back 50, 60 years. So this was a definite challenge. The other big one I'd say was my own personal limitation, because I'm not a lawyer. And therefore, there was a lot that I had to learn and understand before I was able to write about it correctly. But in this aspect, I'm very lucky because my whole family is filled with lawyers. So I was constantly on the phone with one or the other of them. Most often, my uncle Huzaifa Ahmadi, who's here today, asking him all sorts of legal and technical questions. And then, after understanding all of these things, I had to situate them within the politics of the time. Because the judiciary does not exist in a vacuum. One has to understand the socio-political landscape if you want to understand why something happened the way it did or why it happened when it did. And I wanted to be sure that I was writing a book that was accessible to everybody, not just to judges and lawyers. So it was important to connect these dots and to paint a larger picture and then situate the judiciary within it. So this was the writing
And
process.
did he leave notes, your granddad?
Yes, yes. There were some personal writings. You see, my grandfather's initial intention was to write an autobiography. And towards that end, he had started making a few notes, and which I believe he intended to use as the foundation of the book that he would one day write. But unfortunately, he could not do this. He passed away. So after he passed away, I went into his computer and took a look at some of these notes, and I just realized that it's a story that is too important to go untold, and it's a legacy that deserves to be accessible to the country. And so I just felt like I had to write this book.
But you begin interestingly with a chapter called Black Sheep of the Family. For somebody who's done so much and gone on to be the CJI, please explain how he was a black sheep.
You see, my great grandfather was a sub judge during the British Raj, pre-independence India, and therefore he was a very proper gentleman. Everything about him, from the way he dressed, the way he spoke, his personality, his demeanor, everything was extremely proper. And he was very conscious about these things. But his son was the complete opposite of him. So, extremely mischievous, devil may care attitude, always to be found hanging out in the town chalk, not very academically inclined. And of course, his great love cricket. So, bunking classes to play cricket. Although some of the boys that he played with in those days eventually did become very successful. Salim Durrani was one, Jasubai Patel. Both of them played for the national team eventually. But at that time, his parents were very worried about him. And his sense of humor also, they couldn't understand it because he was a prankster. And one of his favorite pranks was to get into it with the local police, the constables, which his parents found very embarrassing. So, you see, in those days, the traffic regulation was that you had to have a working headlight on your bicycle. And these headlights were oil lamps, they were kerosene lanterns. So if it was a very windy day, the light would go out. And then the police would catch the boys, take them to the police station, call their parents, all of that. So obviously, they hated the police. So every now and then, what they would do is they would lie in wait on a windy day, hoping that some police constable passes by whose own lamp has gone out. And then when that happened, they would jump out in a group, creating a huge ruckus, forcing the poor chap to dismount, and then taking him to the police station. So, so my great grandparents were very embarrassed at this sort of behavior. They did not see it as harmless fun. They thought it was a lack of discipline, a lack of focus. In fact, my great grandfather was quite convinced that my grandfather did not have a bright future. So, so he was quite a misfit in his family in some ways, which remained the case until his mid-20s, when the switch in his personality occurred, where he became extremely ambitious, very single-minded about his work, and started developing the qualities that we now associate with him as a former Chief Justice of India. But this wasn't always the case. So therefore,
Was the law an obvious choice for him?
no, in fact, he often used to say that I did not choose the law chose me, because he was actually enrolled to be an engineer. He was studying to be an engineer. And then one fine day, because of a personal disappointment, he decided to change his streams from science to arts. And the main motivation behind doing this was to carve out more time for cricket, because arts will allow you more time so you can play more. And then after that, when he chose the law, it was also with the same disinterest or disassociation that he made that choice. So it was kind of, I mean, kind of, like the fates kind of decided where he needed to be. It was not his decision.
I want to move on to his experience. As I said, as a Muslim officer, I think that's important. At a time, I'm sure there were few Muslims at the district judiciary. He was law secretary as well for a while before his elevation to the High Court. Perhaps once he moved to the High Court and the Supreme Court, things may have marginally changed, though we see from your book they didn't as much. But your reflections on his early experiences, literally as a minority in the system.
Yes, this is a theme that runs across the book because it was a significant aspect of my grandfather's life and his career. You see, there were problems right from the beginning. When he was first appointed as a judge of the City Civil Court in Ahmedabad, there was an uproar in Gujarat because with his appointment, he had become the only Muslim judge on the bench. And this created a lot of anxiety in the minds of communally minded people. So, bar associations across Gujarat came together to strike against his appointment. They boycotted his court, and the strike also became violent at one point. Although they could not target a sitting judge, but they did target his friends. And then his appointment was also questioned in the Legislative Assembly, with several baseless allegations being made. You see, being a person from a minority background meant that he had to face challenges that were specific only to him because of his religion. I'll give you an example. One of the cases that came to him during the very early days on the bench was one that had to do with the question of adoption under Hindu law. And he had given an interpretation that was different from the prevailing interpretation of the time. So here the objection was not the interpretation. The objection was, how dare a Muslim judge challenge previously held interpretations of Hindu law? Now, it's a different matter that eventually his interpretation was accepted to be the correct one, and the text was also changed to amend that, to reflect that. But what I'm trying to say is that this is something that kept coming up for him throughout his life at every step, almost as if religion is some sort of a hurdle that needs to be overcome. So, as you mentioned as well, Aditya, when his name was being considered for Supreme Court judgeship, a senior member of the bench tried to block his name by saying, "But he is a Muslim. Can we trust him?" And then, once he retired as Chief Justice of India, he faced further allegations of having appointed Muslim judges to the bench. Now, obviously, these type of allegations are made by people who don't fully understand the process, because if they did, then they would know that it's not up to one person. But I think in my grandfather's case, it was these types of experiences that made him such a hardcore secularist and such a staunch advocate of the separation between state and religion. So he used to say that the state is there for matters of governance. They will take care of public affairs, healthcare, foreign affairs, these types of things. But religion is every individual's personal concern, and the state should not get into that.
And I also wonder if that impacted his later judicial philosophy, these experiences that he had early on, because as you write in the book, and those of us who've studied his judgments know, that he had a strong bent in favor of the citizen, the underdog. He had an important fundamental rights jurisprudence in the orders that he wrote, and he in fact regarded the freedom of speech as being God-given right, or a gift even, and not something that was merely traceable to the constitution. So in essence, an essential human right that every individual had. So I wonder if you've been able to trace that link between these experiences and his later judicial philosophy, and if not, then what was it that really made him this pro-citizen judge?
You know, there was this very affectionate nickname that he had been given by members of the Gujarat bar at the time that he was a High Court judge in Gujarat. They used to call him the citizen's judge for these reasons, for his bent. And this was also around the time that his judicial philosophy was becoming solidified when he was in the High Court. And I do also think that his childhood years had a bearing on this. You see, like I said earlier, my great grandfather was a sub judge in pre-independence India. And therefore, he was often posted to smaller towns and villages. So, my grandfather ended up spending a very large part of his childhood in rural India. And this is significant because it allowed him to see the true character of India. So, for example, the caste system, which is something that he was very vocal about right up until the end of his life, is because of these early years that he had spent in the villages that he had seen the ugliest face of caste. So he had seen things like people being beaten up for drawing water out of wells that were supposedly not meant for them, or being forced to tie broomsticks behind their backs when they crossed a village so that the broomstick would sweep their footprints away. And other humiliating practices like these. And he had also seen partition. He was 15 years old when India gained independence. So he had seen the kind of communal violence that was prevalent at the time, the type of targeting of minorities that used to take place then. And because all of these experiences took place at a very young age, they made a very deep impact on him and made him think about larger questions like equality, fairness, right and wrong, and then later on questions like how the law can be, how the law should serve people. You see, the judiciary is a very powerful institution. It's the only one that can enforce and protect the rights and civil liberties of the common man. And therefore, he saw the judiciary and his own position within it as a public service. So this is something that you'll see throughout his career on several occasions where he was faced with cases which where the rights of vulnerable communities were at stake. So whether in the case of daily wage workers or Adivasis, prisoners, women, or even just the common man. So yes, I do think that it was these sort of perspectives and experiences that shaped his judicial philosophy, and of course the judgments that he delivered.
Sure. So, citizens judge, also called case cracker, and we'll come to his institutional reforms and his emphasis on mediation and so on a little later. But there is also then Justice Ahmadi, the dissenter, which I made some reference to in my opening remarks, and that is, I think, at the heart of your book, to be honest. And for any lawyer or legal scholar, the charm of reading about a dissent, a good dissent, mind you, and seeing its ramifications, not just legally but socially in the years to come, I think is great food for thought. So I would like you to spend a little bit of time and tell us about his dissents, not just his judgments, but also the man, Justice Ahmadi, that made him, stand strong to his principles. His dissents really came not so much on points of law. I think they came from a place of constitutional belief and philosophy, right? They weren't simple matters of interpretation. They were matters where you're required to stick your neck out and say, I believe in something. And I would therefore like to know from you as a biographer, as a granddaughter, as to what was that made Justice Ahmadi the dissenter.
You made mention of the Babri case in your opening remarks. So I'll talk about that one in particular. You see, I actually remember this time very well because I was 10 years old when the Babri Mosque fell. And I remember it being a time of great tension in our home. And I remember my grandfather being very distressed during those days. He had his misgivings about this matter from the very beginning. And he used to say that when you talk about ownership, you have to remember that India is a very old civilization. It's hundreds and hundreds of years of civilization upon which our current civilization stands. So, how far back can you go to claim ownership? And how can this even be proved in a conclusive way? It's not an advisable path to go down unless you just want to keep fighting forever. And he was also of the mind that the Supreme Court should not have granted permission for the Kar Seva in December 92, the one that eventually led to the demolition of the mosque. You see, in July 1992, the Supreme Court had already given permission for another Kar Seva to be held at the Babri Mosque site. On this occasion, the Kar Sevaks had violated the Supreme Court status quo order and illegally built a platform at the site, which they said will serve as the foundation for the future temple that will one day come up. So, when the UP government came back to the Supreme Court 6 months later, asking for another permission for another Kar Seva, alarm bells started to go off in the courtroom. And several counsel, including the Attorney General of the time, urged the court to refuse this permission, saying that the UP government is up to mischief again. Also, because they had received reports from the Intelligence Bureau suggesting that large groups of men, young men, were being made ready for the Kar Seva with weapons. And around this same time, L.K. Advani, who was a very senior BJP leader of the time, had made a public speech saying that this time the Kar Seva will be held with bricks and shovels. So there was already some sense of what was being planned. But for whatever reason, the court did grant permission for this Kar Seva, and we know what happened after that. We know the shocking and the reprehensible way in which the Babri Mosque was torn down by lumpen elements. Now, shortly after this, the center tried to pass an act called the Acquisition of Certain Area of Ayodhya Act, through which they wanted to gain control of 67 acres of land in Ayodhya, which included the Babri Mosque site, the Ram Janmabhoomi, all of this, but also much more, which was then challenged by Ismail Farooqi, which became the famous Ismail Farooqi case. Now, here the bench was split in a 3-2 ratio. The majority on the bench held in favor of the government, but there were 2 dissenters, Justice Ahmadi and Justice Bharucha. Now, as you can imagine, this was a moment of huge judicial and political pressure. At the time, my grandfather was the senior-most judge in the Supreme Court, in line to become the next Chief Justice. And he knew that if he were to dissent on such a high-stakes matter, such a high-profile matter, he would be publicly going against the executive as well as the Chief Justice of the time. And he knew that this could have repercussions, it could have consequences for him. But he was unable to bring himself to endorse a decision that he felt was unconstitutional. And therefore, he dissented. Now, the dissenting opinion itself, you see, when you read the dissenting judgment, there is a certain anguish that you can sense from the way that the judgment has been written. Because both the dissenting judges were extremely upset by the idea that the Supreme Court should be seen to be favoring one religious community and disfavoring the other. Also because no mention of any consequences for the people who were responsible for the demolition was made in the judgment. In fact, the effect of the act was such that it would require the idols to remain placed where they were in the mosque, for pujas to continue as they had been doing, but at the same time barring Muslims from offering prayers at the site. And, had it been left to Justice Ahmadi, there is a chance that the Babri dispute may not have entered courtroom litigation at all. You see, at the time, he was extremely upset, not just by the demolition, but also by the riots that followed and the growing animosity that he was noticing between Hindus and Muslims. And he felt he was desperate to find a way to diffuse the situation rather than to allow it to escalate any further. So he had made a very strong case to the Chief Justice of the time, asking him to think about mediation. And this is back in the early 90s, where mediation was not as common as it's today. It was quite rare. But he felt that courtroom litigation, by its very nature, is adversarial. And it will lead to more and more acrimony. And it might be better to have all the parties in a room together to see if a mutually acceptable way can be found out of the dispute. But the Chief Justice of the time was not of the same mind, and Babri did enter courtroom litigation. And we know the trajectory the case has taken in the...
And I think on the mediation part, it was prescient because, as all of us know, the ultimate Ayodhya dispute was referred to mediation before the court decided it, to a panel of mediators, and despite best efforts, the settlement could not be arrived at. Of course, in such a case, the scope for mediation when the validity of an legislation is involved, as opposed to a title dispute, is a little more complex because it's a parliamentary act. But that said, it's interesting that mediation was at least placed on the table, though it was not accepted. But I wonder whether then Justice Ahmadi was ready for all consequences, like Justice H.R. Khanna. And I should have mentioned in my opening remarks, just like Justice Chagla's book, Justice Khanna's book, Neither Roses Nor Thorns, is a most readable piece of writing. And he, as you know, lost his Chief Justiceship because of a dissent he wrote, a view that he took against Mrs. Gandhi's government at the time. So was Justice Ahmadi ready for all eventualities? Did he ever indicate that he would put in his papers if he was passed over?
I was 10. So, so no, these conversations were not had in my presence. But I think that we can safely say that he was willing to bear whatever consequences would have taken place had they done so. Because you can see that when he dissented, he knew that this may happen. And he was aware that this was a risk that he was taking. But he chose to do it anyway.
And that doesn't surprise me. And one can safely assume that he was of that mettle, because there is another very interesting episode in the book which relates to the assassination of General Vaidya and the trial of the assassins. We have distinguished officers in our midst. General Vaidya was assassinated as a result of Operation Blue Star, and both his assassins were Sikh. They were convicted, they were sentenced to death, and that matter ultimately came before Justice Ahmadi's bench for confirmation and in appeal. And Justice Ahmadi, in his judgment, confirmed the death penalty. The book also writes about a lot of politicking and hobnobbing that took place thereafter to try and defer the sentence. And like my friend Mr. Jairam here, I'm personally opposed to the death penalty. But this was a case where the court had awarded it. And later, it was upon Justice Ahmadi again to resist the tide and pass consequential orders so that the execution was indeed implemented. And there are very interesting parts in the book about how third parties had moved the court when the accused themselves had said they were ready to go to the gallows. That's just an aside. But the interesting part is that after the assassins were hanged as a result of Justice Ahmadi's judgment, he was advised by his security advisor that one of his senior secretaries was a Sikh gentleman. And therefore, whether Justice Ahmadi would like to consider removing him or moving him from his post. And this is actually reminiscent of the advice that Indira Gandhi got from Mr. Kao, saying that your personal security apparatus is Sikh. She said, no, they are officers. Of course, she paid for it with her life. But that was a real risk. Now, I would doubt that a secretary level officer would be a risk in that sense. But the fact is, the reality of the time was different. And he was advised strongly more than once to consider shifting this officer. And he said, no, I won't do that. Right? And he stuck to his guns and he said, an officer is an officer. And just like me, he's doing his duty. And I think that is also an interesting dimension of Justice Ahmadi's personality. Would you like to comment on this particular episode?
So this is actually a story that goes back to the 1980s, and it has to do with the Khalistan movement of the time. As you rightly pointed out, when so Indira Gandhi, when she ordered Operation Blue Star, which allowed the army to storm the Golden Temple to flush out the separatists that were inside, she obviously earned a lot of hate and anger from a large segment of the Sikh population. And I'm sure, as everybody knows, she was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards eventually. General Vaidya at the time was the chief of army staff, who was responsible for much of the coordination that went into Operation Blue Star. 2 years after Indira Gandhi's assassination, General Vaidya, who was by now retired, was living in Pune with his wife. One morning, he and his wife were going somewhere in their Maruti car when a motorcycle pulled up alongside them with two men on it. They pulled out a gun and they emptied a whole magazine of bullets into the car. The general was dead upon the first bullet, and his wife was badly injured. Now, the two men who killed General Vaidya, their names were Jinda and Sukha. And it was found that they were highly trained militants, and this was not even their first assassination. Prior to this, they had assassinated a Congress leader as well as President Shankar Dayal Sharma's daughter and son-in-law. And now they had assassinated General Vaidya. So when these men were caught and brought to the trial court, they made a statement. They said that, yes, they had assassinated the general. No, they were not sorry. They were in fact proud of what they had done, and they were not afraid of death. So the trial court gave them the death sentence. Then, of course, the case went into appeal and came to the Supreme Court. Now, here, several judges recused themselves from hearing the case out of fear. See, you have to remember that by now, Jinda and Sukha had morphed into legends. They had become like heroes within certain segments of the Sikh population. And they had also managed to gather a lot of support for their cause. In fact, there was a powerful political movement ongoing to stop the execution from taking place, to save Jinda and Sukha's lives. So, and of course, there had been all of these assassinations as well. So, many judges simply did not want to hear the case. Until, of course, it came to Justice Ahmadi's bench, where the judges not only heard the case, but delivered a tough judgment, which is to uphold the death sentence. But as I mentioned earlier, there was this political movement going on. So as a last-ditch effort, Jinda and Sukha's friends filed a petition in the court just days before the execution was to take place, in an effort to arm twist the judges into delaying the execution. So here Justice Ahmadi took a unusual step. He decided to hold a late night hearing at his residence. So the bench was constituted in our home. The whole street, Krishna Menon Marg, where we used to live, was completely cordoned off. Our house was barricaded like some sort of a fortress with police presence, guards, armed guards all over the place, every few steps. Every entry point, every exit point was sealed. And it was under these circumstances that the bench heard the case and upheld the death sentence. The next morning, Jinda and Sukha were hanged to death. And then, of course, came the whole story with the Sikh secretary, where my grandfather absolutely refused, because to his mind, how can you fire an employee on the basis of his religion? He's done nothing wrong. So how can you do this? And he completely refused. At the there were so many pressure tactics that were tried after that by the chief of security to try and get him to change his mind. But he was absolutely unmoved. And the secretary remained with him until the very last day of his tenure.
You mentioned pressure, and from your book, I see that the pressure was not just on the judge himself, but also on the family. That is on Huzaifa and your mother, Tasneem, also a distinguished member of the bar. And for those who think that children of judges have it rosy and have it easy, there's obviously another side to it, which is the rather horrendous sort of campaign that went out against the extended family, the family of a sitting judge, the pressures on whether to appear in that court, whether to appear at all, etc. And I'd like you to comment on that, because I think that's a very important human aspect of someone being on the bench and the extended sort of implications of that on the family.
Yes, I think this is an aspect that is not spoken about enough, and it's really not understood well enough. People think that a judge's life is very cushy and very rosy. It's about big bungalows and red beacon cars, police escorts, all of these things. But in reality, it's much more than that. It's a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. And as you rightly pointed out, these things are not borne by an individual in a vacuum. The entire family has to be aware of their position, aware of what is at stake. And I have engaged with this quite a bit in the book because, as I said, I don't think it's been understood well enough. You see, when my grandfather was a judge in the Supreme Court, both his children, my mother and my uncle, were very young, and they were just starting out in their careers as lawyers. So, in the very beginning, a family meeting was held where both of the siblings realized that this is a very sensitive and a very delicate moment. And so they agreed to a self imposed ban, which is that as long as their father shall remain in the Supreme Court, they will not practice in the Supreme Court. Now, legally, there is no such restriction, but it was more a question of ethics and propriety. To the extent that any brief that was offered to them would first go through several rounds of checks in my grandfather's office to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. So, for example, if there was a potential client who had a different, completely unconnected case in the Supreme Court that may come before Justice Ahmadi, that itself would be a disqualification. They would then not take the case. So, as a result, they ended up rejecting far more cases than they were able to accept, which also meant that their careers took longer to take off. But it was a sacrifice that had to be made, so it was. Despite this, also, they continued to face relentless attacks in the media and within certain groups of lawyers, all with the intention, obviously, to get to my grandfather, get to him through their children, through his children. So it was a very difficult time for the family, but it was also a time that demanded even more dignity and even more care to make sure that integrity cannot be questioned. So at home also, I remember any big festival like Diwali or Eid or whatever it might be, our home would be flooded with guests. And these guests would come with gifts. Here, the protocol which my grandmother had put in place was that while my grandfather was in the drawing room with the guest, she would be in an adjoining room opening up the gifts. And if there was anything that she felt was too extravagant or even slightly inappropriate in any way, it would be handed over to a staff member with instructions to discreetly and politely return it to the guest before they left the premises. So it was a very different life that we lived in those days. My grandfather's position was central to everything that we did.
I want to move on to his reforms, as I mentioned. And my friend Arun is here, Arun Thiruvengadam, a professor of law. And he, in fact, happened to be the first law clerk appointed to the Supreme Court as a result of Justice Ahmadi's initiatives. And he spearheaded certain reforms which have come to stay. We already mentioned mediation and his increasing emphasis on alternative dispute resolution, which sadly has not been able to deal with our crippling caseload. But he also introduced this concept of law clerks, and it's something you just take for granted today. If you're in court, in the Supreme Court, in the High Court, almost every bench has 4, 5, 6 law clerks. There are some here, and they play an important role in assisting judges with their research, sometimes even with the early drafts of certain parts of the judgment. And many judgments acknowledge the role of law clerks, and therefore it's an important assistance given to the bench, right? Which is very important because lawyers have their own support in terms of juniors, interns, etc. Judges traditionally did not, and ultimately the last word is with the bench. And for you to write then a good order, doesn't mean that you rely only on the assistance of the bar, which can sometimes be good, sometimes not so good. So I think his foresight in introducing these reforms, his engagement with technology, all the sort of things that we take for granted today in 2025, largely expedited because of COVID. We wouldn't have moved to VCs and so on at the speed that we did if it was not for COVID, to be honest. But we're talking here about the 90s. And I'd like you to reflect on your granddad's role as, an administrator who thought of these macro policy changes to be introduced to the system to improve justice delivery.
He always used to say that institutional reforms are always worth the effort, even if you don't see results right away. And I think one of the very major parts of his legacy when it comes to institutional reforms is his work in reducing case pendency in India. You see, when he took over as Chief Justice of India, he had inherited a caseload of 120,000 cases. And by the time he retired, this number was down to 18,000. And the way that he managed to do this was by putting into place systems and processes. So things like proper categorization of cases, proper classification of cases, maintaining the composition of a bench until all the cases in a particular group were not heard and disposed of so that the bench does not lose momentum. And he also embraced technology, as you rightly pointed out. So for the very first time, typewriters were removed from the Supreme Court registry and computers were brought in. And he also instructed that all judgments be digitized so that they can be accessible not just to lawyers and judges, but also to academics, journalists, other people who may need to look at a judgment. So judgments were transferred onto floppy disks. In those days, they used to have those floppies. And he also constituted an Indo-US legal exchange team, which was tasked with examining the judicial administrative system to see where the deficiencies were, why case pendency is the way that it is. And this was a nationwide exercise that included every high court in every state. At the end of the study, the team presented their report, which of course had several recommendations, but one of them was mediation, including mediation as an ADR mechanism. Shortly after this, the Indian Parliament also accepted the need for mediation. So the eventual inclusion of Section 89, I believe it is, in the Civil Procedure Code, which includes mediation as an ADR mechanism, is a direct consequence of the work that was done by Justice Ahmadi as Chief Justice. Apart from that, he also revolutionized legal education in India. You see, at the time, legal education was going through a crisis. The law colleges were of very poor quality. Exams were being conducted in a somewhat dubious fashion. And the graduates that were coming out of these colleges were not fit to practice. So the high-powered Ahmadi committee was formed with the intention of giving the system an overhaul. So the 5-year law program, which has now become standardized, is a direct outcome of the work that was done by the Ahmadi committee. So also are the national law schools, of which I think we have 26 now. I think 26. Yeah, okay. And then, of course, you have the judicial clerkship program, which was an idea that came to Justice Ahmadi when he was in Washington, D.C., because that's where he saw the program in effect and decided that he would like to come back to India and replicate it. At that time, he didn't know whether it would take off at all, whether it would be a success or not. But look at it now, it's one of the most prestigious programs. And of course, Arun is the first judicial clerk ever.
My last question, not just because we're running against time, but also because I'd like you all to read the book, buy the book, is a question relating to a post-retirement episode in Justice Ahmadi's life. And this is something I wrote about in my review also. It's a fascinating situation. And this related to the succession to the Sayadna upon his passing. And many of you will know the Sayadna is the spiritual head of the Bohra Muslim community and a very spiritually, religiously, and even otherwise a very influential and important position. And upon the death of the Sayyidna then, there were two rival claimants to the post of the Sayyidna. One was, of course, his son, the other was the nephew, in a sense, an half-brother. Half-brother. There was, in a sense, an outlier. Now, the half-brother reached out to Justice Ahmadi, who was also a Bohra Muslim, seeking his support and endorsement for his claim to the post of the new Sayyidna. And at that point, against the run of play, one would say, Justice Ahmadi asked for the papers and the files to be brought to him. He studied them, and upon review of the evidence before him, of course not in a judicial capacity, he decided that this gentleman had a case. And he decided accordingly to stick his neck out and stand for this claim that was being made to this post of the Sayyidna. Now, obviously a very difficult, challenging decision to make because of the implications within the larger community. Of course, as a matter of fact, the dispute went to the Bombay High Court, and the individual that Justice Ahmadi, stood by, ended up having his suit dismissed by the Bombay High Court, and I believe the matter is in the Supreme Court. I'm not sure. I think it is probably pending in appeal. But for me, the judicial outcome is secondary. I think the fact that Justice Ahmadi was able to again take a principled position based on his conviction, and something that cost him heavily within his own community. There are a lot of assumptions you make here that a retired Chief Justice is going to sit pretty and enjoy status and importance and power for the rest of their lives. That's not always the case. And as your book demonstrates, your grandparents were both, in a way, sidelined within the community for taking this unpopular position. They were not even able to be buried in the Bohra Kabristan because of this stand that he took. And this is a fascinating part, I think, of his life, and especially his post-retirement life. And therefore, before we close, I would like you to comment upon this particular episode.
Yes, my family belongs to the Dawoodi Bohra community, which is a small, close-knit sect within the Shia branch of Islam. And the community is led by a religious and spiritual head called the Dai-e-Mutlaq, or the Sayyidna. The Sayyidna is the spiritual head of the community, but he's also responsible for welfare of the community. And for most Bohras, their entire world is tied with the Sayyidna, with the activities of the Sayyidna, the religious and administrative setup that exists around the Sayyidna. And this is not just for spiritual guidance, this is also for everyday life. So things like access to mosques, access to burial grounds, access to certain schools and colleges that they run, religious affairs, community activities, all of these things are tied to that one central authority. And most Bohras will turn to this ecosystem throughout every important moment in their lives, from birth to death. So in a way, your sense of belonging, your sense of identity, everything is tied to community life in that way. Now, you see, in 2014, when the last Sayyidna passed away, two people came forward, both of them saying that they had been appointed as the successor. One of them was the son of the previous Sayyidna, who immediately assumed control and took over the administration of the community. The other one was his half-brother and also his Mazoon. The Mazoon is the second in command. So when this happened, it tore the community apart because everybody was forced to take sides. And everything, your family relationships, friendships, everything became tied up in this split. Most people, a very large minority, chose to side with the person who had taken over as Sayyidna, the son. A very small minority chose to side with the Mazoon. And because my grandfather was the most illustrious member of the family, all eyes were on him to see what he was going to do. So when he received a request from the Mazoon asking for legal advice, he agreed to travel to Bombay to examine the evidence. He spent 3 days in Bombay looking through all of the evidence and all of the other materials that had been made ready for his visit. And at the end of the 3 days, he came to the conclusion that the Mazoon's claim was legitimate and he was prepared to support it. So he flew back home, spoke with his wife, and the next day, both of them made their public announcement. Now, of course, when they did this, it created another churn because several members followed his lead and several others expressed their support, but also said that they were not in a position to take a public stand. Because, as I said earlier, the Bohra life is very connected to the community and the Sayyadna. So, taking a stand like this means risking social boycott, which not many people were willing to do. Now, just a little bit of a backstory on my grandparents. You see, my grandfather was not a religious man. In fact, he came from a family that was very much on the periphery of community life. But my grandmother was deeply religious, and her family had very close personal ties to the Sayyadna. So, her sense of identity, her sense of belonging was very much tied to community life. And it was after marrying her that my grandfather also became somewhat interested. And also, the more successful he became, the more they started relying on him for advice. So I remember every now and then, the Sayyadna's emissaries would travel from Bombay to Delhi to consult with my grandfather, not just on legal matters, but other things as well, like projects that they were undertaking or problems that they might be having, whatever it might be. And they had also conferred upon him the title of Sheikh, which is a felicitation. It's like a mark of prestige. So, when my grandparents took this decision, they did so knowing that all of this would become disrupted, everything would change. And it did. Almost immediately, the coercion and the pressure tactics started. Once again, people started traveling from different parts of the country to meet my grandfather to see if they could convince him to change his mind. My grandmother also was under a lot of pressure with people saying things to her, like, think about what you're doing. You may lose your family relationships. Your friends will turn away from you. You'll become ostracized. Now, some of these were, of course, well meaning people who were genuinely worried. But there were also those that came with veiled threats, like the one person who called up my grandmother to say, when your time comes, don't you want to be buried in a Bohra graveyard with all of the rituals done for you correctly? Obviously, suggesting that if you don't succumb, then this will not be available to you. So, yes, some friendships did fall apart. Some relatives also started keeping a distance from us because nobody wanted to anger the person who had taken over as Dai. And because they were now in a position to, they were also in charge of community spaces, they were in a position to bar us from accessing them. So, community life for us changed completely. Things like going to the mosque on Muharram, which is something we did every year, that had to stop. Things like ziyarat, which is a very typical Bohra tradition of visiting the graves of your ancestors, the graves of previous Sayyadnas, that had to stop. And of course, this was particularly painful for my grandmother because she was very deeply entrenched in community life. But the more that these types of coercive means were applied, the more determined they became. Because to them, this was a moral question, and moral questions demand sacrifices. To the point that shortly before they passed away, both my grandparents took a decision that they would like to be buried in a Muslim graveyard, like a normal Muslim graveyard. And that's exactly what has happened. Both my grandparents are buried in a regular Muslim graveyard in Delhi. It's not a Bohra graveyard. And this was as per their wishes, as a mark of their conviction. So that's how my grandparents ended up becoming the flag bearers of the minority within the Dawoodi Bohra community.
Thank you, Insia, and we'll hand over to the audience now.
You've spoken about the deep sense of integrity your granddad had, but a lot of judges, regardless of their integrity, often have a judgment that they either regret or they're embarrassed by, either because their views change later in life. Was there any judgment that Justice Ahmadi regretted, if not embarrassed by, but regretted passing or siding with the majority that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. I've never heard him say anything like that.
You've spoken a lot about principles, and you've also spoken a lot about subjects that are very political. Not just now, but also I'm assuming in the book. While Mr. Sondhi didn't want to talk about too much about your book, there is an excerpt of the deliberations behind the Babri Masjid case on a couple of websites. So you said there, for example, that when the bench deliberated and decided on signing the majority versus having a dissenting opinion, that all of the judges weren't called for that conference. So I think this is more of a question about process. How did you decide what to include and what not? In the sense of stepping on toes, I suppose. How did you decide that some were okay to say, and I'm sure that there were a lot that you decided you didn't want to publicly see. So how do you make that decision?
See, the idea was to write an honest book. And the portions that you're referring to are directly taken from my grandfather's own personal writings. So, honestly, I did not want to leave much out, because one does want to write a book where the reader gets a sense of who the person was and the kind of things that drove him. So, to answer your question, I really haven't left very much out at all. The only things that I've left out are, like on technical grounds, like things that I was unable to verify because of the lack of documentation or whatever. But otherwise, no, I haven't left much out at all.
Yeah, my question is about the timing of the book itself. Do you think what took you so long? I'm asking you this because would it have made a difference before the Ayodhya judgment came recently? In that light, in building public perception, or in taking us back to the happenings of the 90s, would it have made any difference at all, you think? And this is just speculative, and I'm thinking I wish, after hearing all this, I wish it had come earlier.
This, I couldn't have written this book earlier because, like I said, my grandfather's intention was to write his own autobiography. And he was in the process of, so like I said earlier, he was making notes and he was hoping to one day write this book. It's after he passed that I felt like it would be a real shame to not have these thoughts out in the world and not have this book written, which is why I ended up writing it. So it couldn't have happened during his lifetime.
Hello, myself Parveen. I have gone through, cursory reading of Justice Ahmadi. Even I knew it when I was a student of Professor Aruni. He used to say proudly that I served Ahmadi. So I also served as a law clerk to Justice Vinit Saran, retired from High Court. He elevated to Karnataka High Court to Supreme Court. Now, it's a very interesting part of Justice Ahmadi is, like many other judges, he never sought for the profitable offices. He went for the academics. How proud are you when judges are looking after their retirement? And in such a situation, when the pre-retirement judgments are influencing their post-retirement post, so he joined the academics. How proud you are?
No, very proud indeed, because I think it says something about the principles of the person. It says something about the independence of the person, that he was able to stand up to the executive, which is, something that one may argue is something we should see more of nowadays. But yes, very proud, because he did not take up any government assignment after that. Like you rightly pointed out, he did other things which had nothing to do with the executive.
Hello, hi. We've discussed much about the qualities of Justice Ahmadi, and we talked about the Babri judgment and the much known judgments of Justice Ahmadi. My question is that obviously you read a lot of judgments while working on this book. and you have known him better than anybody else in this room, I'm guessing. Was there any particular judgment in that you came across where you saw that, okay, it's a lesser known judgment, but all the qualities and the principles that he stood for were right there for everybody to see?
It's not just one judgment, but there are several judgments in which he has overturned orders of lower courts in order to protect individuals' right to freedom of speech and expression. So there are a series of several judgments. There's the Bandit Queen case, for example, which was the film on Phulan Devi that was struggling to get a certificate from the censor board. There's cases where individuals have approached the court saying that their articles were not being published because they were dissenting in nature. Documentary filmmakers have approached the court saying that the state was blocking their films because they were showing the state in poor light. So these judgments actually, I mean, these are things that I did not know about. But I did know, of course, that he was a great champion of the freedom of speech and expression. So these were a nice, happy surprise for me to come upon.
Good evening. I have another question. You're aware about the mayoral election in New York where Zoran Mamdani won, right? So he identifies as a Muslim socialist, and of course, the voting public won in his favor. My question is, across the globe in New York, Indians here today, especially people, my peers, are celebrating Mamdani's win. And the funny part is, we can't even vote in New York. We're Indian citizens. And the question's to both of you, of course. Do you find it ironic that we as Indians are celebrating a electoral win in another part of the country, despite having legacies like Justice Ahmadi in our country as well? And of course, do you attribute it to the communal tensions that have started over the course of the decade? So I just want to understand how you interpret the celebration that we're having for Mamdani's win. Yeah.
I think it's well deserved. I mean, I'm very happy and I'm also celebrating. So, so yeah, I mean, I don't see the problem with that. I think it's, he stands for principles that some of us also believe very deeply in. So yeah, I don't see the difficulty with that. Although you might.
No, I think he's being endorsed less as a socialist and more as a sort of an anti-climax and a moral victory of sorts. So in that sense, I belong to that camp also. But the irony is, of course, there that left parties in India are practically non-starters in elections. Somebody had tweeted today saying, how many people stood by Sitaram Yechury and his politics? Did the left have a say in electoral politics? It didn't. So if you're ideologically socialist and you support a socialist win in New York, but you're unable to vote socialist in India, then you're a hypocrite. But I think most people are in support more on a moral platform, as Insia said, than a socialist or a political one.
You mentioned about when he came on the bench, there weren't too many Muslim jurists at that time, and therefore there was a backlash right from Gujarat. Did that happen as he rose up to the High Court as well as in the Supreme Court? And it is also said in pieces that he tried to promote the interest of the Muslim community in society in general. And then he's becoming the Vice Chancellor of the Aligarh Muslim University without having had an educationalist background. Was that something that resulted in his promoting the cause of the Muslims?
So like I mentioned earlier, his experiences on the bench, whether it was in the City Civil Court or in the High Court or in the Supreme Court, where he certainly faced discrimination, was very much a reason for his own views on secularism. And also his childhood years, as I mentioned earlier, he had seen partition, he had seen all those types of things. And for him, it had made him into a secularist. It had made him into somebody who was very firm about the separation between state and religion, the equality between different religions. His advocacy for minority rights was his personal belief as well. because he did feel, as many of us do, that minorities are not treated as they should be in India. And therefore, he did raise his voice for that.
Yeah, so a question here on public life of a judge, right? You touched on this a little bit, but this one thing has intrigued me about day in the life of a family member of a judge, right? Because it's not that common that when you go to a beach in Goa, you see a judge, or you go to a movie and you happen to see a judge. So can you tell us a little bit more about the protocols and things that go on when you're a family member of a judge, and that too especially it's a high court or a Supreme Court judge?
It's interesting that you mentioned movies. I don't think he saw a single movie during the entire time that he was a Supreme Court judge, for this reason, because there are so many protocols, there's security concerns, there are 1,000 other things that you have to think about. Going out for dinner was something that we could not do because my grandfather could not. So the rest of us would go out, but he would not be able to join us. So yeah, there were several restrictions that he had to live under. And not just him, but for all of us, like security, for example, was, I mean, I was a child, and therefore for me this was the most tiresome thing, that we all had to be followed around by security personnel. Everybody had their own private PSO, and that person would just follow you around everywhere you go. Which, I mean, in our lives it had become sort of normalized, but now when you look back, you realize how strange, a life it was then.
Please join me in thanking both Insia and Aditya for the session this evening. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to both of you.